For the better part of 3.5 centuries, we've lived with a certain assumption, haven't we? That the sovereign nation state is, well, the way of the world. It's the basic building block of our global system. But what if it's not? What if this entire era of the state isn't the final chapter of political history, but just a phase? That's the rather profound question I want us to tackle today. Welcome. And in this particular analysis, we're going to pull apart one of the most foundational stories, I would even call it a myth, in all of international relations, the Westphalian system. We're going to dig into its origins, question its supposed universality, and then look at the very real signs that we might already be living in a post-Westphalian world.
All right, so here's our roadmap. We'll start with the Westphalian myth itself. Then we'll look at the state's real competitive edge. After that, and this is crucial, we'll discuss pre-Westphalian global ethics. Then we'll touch on what some are calling the neo-medieval return, and finally, we'll consider a world beyond states. Let's get started.
So, let's begin where most textbooks on this subject do, with this idea of a neat, clean break from the past. You know the story. A single, momentous event that supposedly created the modern world order as we know it. And that moment, of course, is the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. It's held up as this great watershed. It put an end to the absolutely devastating 30 Years' War in Europe, and it's credited with creating the entire nation-state system. You see this idea reinforced later by things like the Treaty of Utrecht. By the time of its 300th anniversary in 1948, this version of history was pretty much set in stone. Now, the central idea that supposedly came out of this is something we call Westphalian sovereignty. It's really quite simple, but incredibly powerful. It boils down to two core principles. First, internal sovereignty. The ruler, the state, has the final say inside its own borders. No one else. Second, external sovereignty. Each state is independent and free from meddling by outside powers. This has been the bedrock of international relations for generations. And this quote from the very influential legal scholar Leo Gross really captures the almost sacred status given to Westphalia. He called it the majestic portal which leads from the old world into the new world. A majestic portal. It's a powerful image, isn't it? The problem is, as we're about to see, this so-called portal might actually hide more of history than it illuminates. Okay, so if the story of this majestic portal isn't quite right, if the state wasn't just born in a single moment, then how did it become the dominant form of political life? Well, the answer isn't about some grand historical destiny. It's actually about a very real, very fierce competition. Think about the late Middle Ages. As the old feudal system started to crumble, there wasn't a clear next step. The sovereign state, as we know it, well, it was just one of many ideas floating around. You had these incredibly powerful city leagues, like the Hanseatic League, and of course the famous independent city-states in Italy. The point is, history wasn't a straight line leading to the state. It was a messy, competitive free-for-all. So that brings us to the million-dollar question. Why did the state win this competition? The work of the political scientist Hendrik Spruyt gives us a really compelling and, frankly, unsentimental answer. It comes down to institutional efficiency. Sovereign states were simply better organized for the world that was emerging. Think about it. They could standardize laws and taxes across the territory, which made trade and business much easier. They were also more credible partners in diplomacy. You knew who to talk to, and you knew they could enforce a deal. But the real game changer? Resource mobilization. States were just better at raising money and fielding armies. So the state didn't win because it was a better idea in some moral sense. It won because it was a more effective and ruthless machine for accumulating and projecting power. And now we come to what I believe is the absolute core of this entire discussion. You see, the Westphalian myth isn't just a flawed historical account. It carries a deeply problematic assumption, the idea that international law, political morality, the very notion of global ethics were all somehow invented in Europe. This is a narrative that we simply must challenge and challenge forcefully. And we can. Thanks to the work of scholars like Muhammad Mizanur Rahman, we see what a critical oversight this has been. When you actually look at pre-Westphalian Islamic literature, a vast body of scholarship that's been frankly ignored by mainstream Western thought for centuries, what do you find? You find a rich, sophisticated, and detailed discussion about the very same ethical questions Europe claimed to have discovered much, much later. The key concept here is CR. And please understand, this isn't some obscure, recently discovered idea. This is a well-established branch of Islamic jurisprudence that goes all the way back to the 8th century. It is, for all intents and purposes, Islamic international law. It provides a detailed framework for how a state should conduct itself with others, both in times of war and, just as importantly, in times of peace.
And just look at how remarkably developed this ethical framework was. The principles of CR include protecting non-combatants, women, children, the elderly. It explicitly prohibits torture and mutilation. It stresses the sanctity of treaties and truces, provides guarantees of asylum regardless of race or religion, and even forbids the wanton destruction of crops and livestock. The parallels to things like the modern Geneva Conventions, they aren't just there, they are striking. It leads to an unavoidable conclusion. Political morality in the global sphere is not some Western invention. It is a shared, cross-cultural human project that long predates 1648. So we've dismantled the story of the past. Now let's pivot to our world today. Because that model of absolute, undivided state sovereignty, the very hallmark of the Westphalian Age, well, it seems to be breaking down. And it's giving way to something new, something far more complex, and in a strange way, something that looks a lot like the distant past. The scholar Hedley Bull was remarkably ahead of his time on this. All the way back in 1977, he coined a term for this trend, neo-medievalism. He saw a future where the state would lose its monopoly on power. Authority, he argued, would become fragmented again, shared between states, yes, but also with international bodies, massive corporations, and all sorts of other non-state actors. It would create a messy system of overlapping layers of governance, which sounds an awful lot like the pre-Westphalian world, doesn't it? And if you want a perfect, real-world example of this, just look at the RCEP, the huge economic partnership in Asia. On paper, it's a deal signed by nation-states. But let's be honest about who really governs. The states negotiate the formal treaty, sure, but it's the multinational corporations, the Alibabas and Samsungs, who are shaping and even implementing the standards. It's the digital platforms like Tencent that control the crucial cross-border data flows. The global logistics networks, they manage the supply chains that can make or break a national economy. This is what multi-layered, neo-medieval governments looks like in practice. And believe me, this has profound implications for understanding the ongoing struggle for genuine sovereignty across South Asia and the Muslim world, where state power is constantly being challenged and negotiated with these powerful non-state and external forces. All right, let's pull all of these threads together now. By looking past the simple myth of Westphalia, we can see the arc of history in a completely different way. It's not a straight line, not a simple march towards the all-powerful state. It's something far more dynamic, more cyclical. Think of it like this. In the pre-Westphalian world, authority was messy, fragmented, overlapping between feudal lords, the church, empires. Then you have the Westphalian period, a very distinct era, let's say from the mid-17th to the late 20th century, defined by centralized, exclusive, territorial state power. And now? Now it seems we're entering a neo-medieval or post-Westphalian phase. Authority is once again becoming refragmented, layered, and shared between states, corporations, platforms, and so on. The Westphalian model was incredibly important, no doubt, but the key takeaway is that it was a phase, not the final destination. And that brings us right back to where we started, but now with a completely different perspective. The world of sovereign states isn't some eternal, unshakable truth. It was a historical construct, one that emerged for very specific reasons, and now it appears to be changing right before our eyes. And acknowledging that forces us to ask a truly profound question. If the sovereign state was only a phase, what comes next? And perhaps, more urgently, how do we learn to navigate a world where power no longer resides only in the places we've been taught to look for it?